This is a summary of the second section from Kant's Groundwork of the Metaphysics of Morals. Kant thinks that it might be impossible to find any action that is for the sake of duty alone. He thinks that our motives are mixed, and he thinks that even if we were to find an action that we thought was pure, we might just be deceiving ourselves. But he's not concerned with the empirical evidence because he thinks he has an a priori argument for moral reality. He says, quote, even though a sincere friend might never yet have existed, pure sincerity in friendship is required no less of every person, because, prior to all experience, this duty, as duty in general, lies in the idea of reason determining the will on a priori grounds. This is section 408. So he thinks that the moral law must be apodictic, in which means he thinks it's got to be a certain proof available to all rational beings as such. And he thinks that to recognize the moral good in others, even the moral good of a moral exemplar or a moral role model like Jesus Christ, requires that we have this prior idea of moral perfection in our minds. He says that if the law is not a priori in this way, grounded in metaphysics, morality would, one, not be clear, two, would not be powerful enough to influence behavior, and three, sinks to what is popular. And he says of things that are popular, this is just a, quote, disgusting mishmash of compiled observations and half-reasoned principles. Shallow minds, he says, enjoy this for their everyday chit-chat, but the insightful just look away. That's section 409. So the moral law is different from the laws of nature in that we rational beings have a faculty to live in accordance with these moral laws or our awareness of these laws. So he divides the moral landscape or moral reality up into these two domains. On the one side, he has the objective domain, and on the other side, he has the subjective domain. In the objective domain, he places laws and reason. In the subjective domain, he places will and actions. So actions flow from a will that chooses what reasons commend, and reason recognizes the moral law. So here you have how the two domains fit together. He thinks that an imperative is a should statement or an ought statement. The command, basically, he says, quote, the imperative is a formula of the law's command. And so you have these objective principles formulated in these ought statements. He says we've already looked at a categorical imperative, but now he brings up the hypothetical imperative, which he defines as the practical necessity of a possible action as a means to something else that is willed. In other words, if you have a goal to accomplish some action, then you have some principles that you need to follow or some obligations to fulfill, some imperatives to follow in order to reach that goal that you have. He says, just as a doctor wants to treat a patient, if the doctor wants to treat a patient, they've got certain steps to follow in order to do that. And even if that would be a rule of skill, or he calls it, it's a technical imperative. There's also what he calls rules of prudence, which are pragmatic imperatives, which is if you want to be happy, then you have to follow these steps. These are still just hypothetical imperatives. They are not moral in nature. But the categorical imperative is a command, he says, that represents, quote, an action as necessary of itself without reference to another end. So it's not something you have to follow because you want to reach some goal or some end out there. It's not for some purpose other than itself. Christine Korsgaard, who I've mentioned before, and this is the book I'm getting this from, Christine Korsgaard says that a moral rule does not say, do this if you want that, but simply do this. This is from page 10 in this book, and I highly recommend this book, especially for graduate students. It really helps you understand Kant's moral philosophy. So that's what Korsgaard says, and here we have the categorical imperative, number one, again, in section 421, quote, act only on that maxim you can at the same time will should become a universal law. And for the rest of the section, this part, he discusses several cases where he applies the categorical imperative. So the first case is the one of suicide, and he asks, is it okay to take my own life when my future life just doesn't look very good to me? And he thinks that no, this is not okay according to the categorical imperative, because it would be a contradiction to will to end one's life by the same feeling that is meant to preserve your life. Secondly, he considers the case of making a false promise to repay a loan. Would it be okay if you found yourself in financial difficulties to make a false promise to borrow some money that you know you could never repay? And he says no, because in a world in which this were the right thing to do, to make false promises to repay loans, it would be impossible to make a false promise. And so here you have another contradiction or another impossibility. Next, he considers the case of squandering one's talents. Is it okay to play Xbox all day and not cultivate your talents? He says no, because rational beings necessarily want to cultivate their talents, which would be useful to themselves later. And finally, he considers the case of charity. Is it okay not to be charitable? Is it okay not to be generous with others? And he thinks, no, it's not, because we ourselves depend on the generosity of others. And if we ever in the future found ourselves in a situation where we needed other people's generosity, and it was a universal law not to be generous, or it was okay not to be generous, we might find ourselves with no one to help us. All right, I hope that was helpful.